Chapter 8. Social Results of Protestantism. Article 1. Introductory. Summary of the preceding. In the foregoing chapters, we have attempted to convey some idea of the effects upon social life of Christian as contrasted with non-Christian principles and methods. The latter, which rests upon egoism and the glorification of brute force, held undisputed sway in Europe during the early centuries of the Roman Empire and were again partially re-established after the Teutonic conquests of the 5th and following centuries. In both cases, they resulted in the oppression, pauperization, or degradation of the weaker members of society, especially women, the poor, and slaves. On the other hand, the Christian regime, which prevailed to a considerable extent over the Roman Empire, immediately before the Teutonic invasions, and was gradually restored and perfected during the Middle Ages, secures respect for human dignity and protection for the personal rights of every member of society, even the poorest and weakest, and an effectual recognition in social relations of the essential brotherhood of men. Under the Christian regime, justice and charity are practiced and cooperation and mutual help promoted, so that every member of the community is usually attached to some organized body from which he can, when need requires, claim protection and assistance. Hence, medieval society, notwithstanding its many shortcomings, was on the whole the best the world had hitherto known. In that society there were protection and security for the poor and weak, and as a rule, tolerable material conditions for all. Substantial happiness and contentment prevailed, and consolations of religion making up for many material hardships. The ideal of human brotherhood was in practice substantially realized, and there existed a sympathetic union between the different social classes. At least, all of these traits are to be found in the medieval Christian society in a larger measure than Europe had ever previously known or has experienced since. End of Catholic regime. The change from the Christian regime first began to be seriously felt in the 15th century. After the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in the year 1453, Greek scholars crowded into Italy, France, and Germany, bringing with them the treasures of classical literature and art, which they had rescued from the fallen city. The sudden spread of pagan Greek learning and culture, combined with debased pagan ideals masquerading as humanism, together with an unprecedented accession of wealth, consequent upon the discovery of the New World and the opening up of the maritime routes to the Far East, tended to produce a great deterioration of morals, especially among the leisured and privileged classes. All this, combined with other causes already touched upon, prepared the way for the great catastrophe of the 16th century, commonly called the Protestant Reformation. This marks the turning point at which the history of modern Europe begins. The new phase in social conditions. As a result of this fatal upheaval, the unity of Christendom was broken, and large portions of Europe were detached from the ancient faith. At the same time, the influence of the Church was so seriously weakened, even in countries that remained Catholic, that non-Christian principles were gradually reintroduced into political and social life, and many of the characteristics of the old pagan regime began to reappear. Prominent among these characteristics are the absolutism of the government, whether the latter be a monarchy or so-called democratic body, an ever-growing tendency to bring domestic life under the despotic control of the secular state, a practical disregard for the human dignity and independence of a person who is without property or power, a revival of the old pagan conception of the absolute rights of ownership and disregard of its responsibilities and duties, the gradual disappearance of communal property and of the cooperative social organizations which did so much under the Christian regime to safeguard the interests of the poor. Among the results of all this have been the concentration of the material resources of the nation under the control of a few individuals, and the practical enslavement and degradation of the unpropertied masses, with the consequent reappearance of the fierce antagonism between the rich and the poor. Leo XIII, writing of modern eras and revolutionary movements, traces the great evils of modern life to the Protestant revolt of the 16th century. These venomous teachings, the principles of the Protestant reformers, like pernicious seed, scattered far and wide among the nations, have produced in course of time death-bearing fruit, deriving pretentiously its name from reason and false doctrine, has pervaded the whole of civilized society. Hence, governments have been organized without God or his divinely established order being taken into account. It has even been contended that public authority originates not from God, but from the mass of the people, which, considering itself unfettered by the all-divine sanction, refuses to submit to any laws that it has not passed of its own free will. The very author and redeemer of mankind has been forced slowly and gradually to withdraw from the scheme of studies at universities, colleges, and high schools, as well as from all the practical working of public life. The keen longing after happiness has been narrowed down to the range of the present life. No wonder that tranquility no longer prevails in public or private life, or that the human race has been hurried onward, well nigh to the verge of ruin. Division of the subject. In order to convey an adequate idea of the effects upon social life of the 16th century revolt, we shall first sketch briefly the course of events by which Protestantism secured a firm foothold in northern Europe, and then indicate under a few main headings the most notable changes in political and social life that followed as a result from the Protestant revolt. We shall next discuss the social and economic theories of unchristian liberalism, which was the logical outcome of Protestant teaching. As modern capitalism has borrowed its ultra-individualistic character from Protestant and liberal principles, we shall treat briefly of it and the deplorable social conditions which have resulted from it. We shall then discuss socialism, which is at bottom merely a phase of liberalism, though differing from its economic doctrines. In a supplementary chapter, we shall strive to show how all the anti-Christian and anti-social elements of modern society are more or less concentrated in, or rather are represented by, the doctrines and tendencies of an aggressive worldwide organization born of Protestantism and repeatedly condemned by the Vicar of Christ, Freemasonry. After discussing briefly the main headings of the social evils resulting from all these modern doctrines and movements, we shall conclude our historical sketch with a short review of the Catholic social movement, which has now spread into almost every country of Europe and America, and aims at the re-establishment of Christian principles in political and social life. Article 2. Rise and Spread of Protestantism. Its Beginnings. Protestantism began in Germany. The main driving force behind the movement, there as elsewhere, was not religion, but personal ambition, or avarice, or lust, or all these motives combined. The leader of the movement was Martin Luther, an apostate Augustinian friar, of remarkable ability, unbridled passions, and boundless ambition. Luther launched the revolt against the Church on October 31st, 1517, when he posted his celebrated 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg. The name Protestant. The name Protestant is derived from the protest presented by the German Lutheran princes at the Diet of the Holy Roman Empire, held at Speyer in the year 1529. In this protest, they rejected and condemned as unjust and impious the imperial decree first promulgated at the Diet of Worms 5 years before, and now again renewed at Speyer, which prohibited the princes from forcing the new religion upon those of their subjects that wished to adhere to the old faith. The name was originally used to designate only the protesting princes, but it was gradually extended to include all the adherents of the new religion, whether Lutheran, Anglican, Calvinistic, or belonging to any one of the numberless sects into which Protestantism gradually broke up. The name has been accepted by Protestants themselves, and is appropriate insofar as it is closely associated, both historically and etymologically, with opposition to Catholicism. For disagreement with Catholic doctrine and practice, and especially with the teaching, authority, and governing power of the Church, is practically the only point upon which all Protestants are at one. Nature of Protestantism. Protestantism, as a system of religious practice and belief, is vague and indefinite, which it needs must be, when every man is constituted the ultimate arbiter of his own obligations, and the deciding authority in regards to the truths of faith, which he may reject or accept. For this tenet, which is called the right of private judgment, is a fundamental principle in Protestantism. The system may be loosely described as resting on, or centering round, three standard principles. These are as follows. A. The Bible, as interpreted by each individual for himself, is the sole rule of faith, Christian tradition being thus rejected. B. Man is justified by faith alone, so that good works are useless for salvation or merit. C. As a result of the foregoing principles, there is no room for a divinely constituted priesthood or hierarchy. For since every man is his own supreme teacher, and is able to sanctify himself by an easy act of faith or trust in God, without the aid of sacrament or sacrifice, the priesthood, if retained at all, is not to be considered an essential part of the church organization. These principles, however, were never fully accepted by all Protestants. In fact, the first, which confers on all the right of private judgment in religious matters, manifestly excludes the possibility of a consistent system of practice or belief. The proclamation and propagation of the new principles, however, attain the desired object of destroying the authority and organization of the Church over large portions of Christendom. Rapid spread of Protestantism. Within little more than half a century, from the commencement of Luther's revolt, Protestantism had definitely gained the upper hand in the central and northern Germany, also in Holland, Denmark, Scandinavia, and in a great part of Switzerland, as well as in England and Scotland. The new religion had also made great progress in Austria, Bavaria, and other portions of Germany, as well as in Hungary, Bohemia, and Poland. The fate of France, in which the Huguenots, a strong aggressive faction of fanatical Calvinists, were in open rebellion against the king, was hanging in the balance. Ireland, where most of the Irish princes and Anglo-Irish barons, as well as very many leading ecclesiastics had, as in England, accepted the usurped ecclesiastical supremacy of the English king, was also in imminent peril of being lost to the faith. Even in Italy and Spain, the subversive movement had made no little headway. Its causes. The rapid progress of the new religion was partially due to real abuses in the discipline and administration of the Church. These abuses had existed for a considerable time, and for more than a century before Luther's time, all sincere Catholics had been striving in vain to bring about a thorough reform of the Church and its head and members. Many of the clergy of all ranks were leading very worldly lives. Money was often extorted from the people in unjustifiable ways, or to an unreasonable extent. Neglect of the sacraments was widespread in many places. The principal cause, however, of the rapid spread of the revolt was the methods adopted by the innovators, whose real aim was the complete overthrow of the Church, and who mobilized in support of their movement and all the worst instincts of men. In their code of morals, they deliberately pandered to the most depraved human passions. Sin, according to the new doctrine, presented no obstacle to eternal salvation. Pride, lust, avarice, injustice, cruelty, and the rest were to be healed or covered over by an easy act of trust in God. The Lutheran doctrine rejecting the utility of good works was carried still further by Calvin, according to whose teaching men are predestined to heaven or hell, without any account being taken of their actions. For in the Calvinist doctrine the human will is not free, and so men's actions are not worthy either of reward or punishment. Besides the strong appeal to men's depraved passions, which such doctrines contain, many other inducements were held out to draw the people away from the ancient religion. The immense fortune of the Church, the patrimony of the poor, was now to be the prize of apostasy. Political and religious independence allured the kings and princes. The abolition of tithes, confession, fasting, and other irksome obligations attracted the masses. Many persons were deceived into the new religion by outward appearances of Catholicism, which the innovators carefully maintained as in England and the Scandinavian kingdoms. Amongst the people that were not depraved, Protestantism made progress only as a result of deception or under pressure of coercive force. From the very beginning, the innovators, after the example of the Mohammedans nearly 1,000 years before, propagated the new religion with the Bible in one hand and the sword in the other. Over the whole of Christendom, from Switzerland in the south to Scotland and Scandinavia in the north, fierce and bloody wars were stirred up, which continued to desolate Europe for more than 100 years. The long, drawn-out civil wars in Germany terminated only in 1649 by the Peace of Westphalia. The fierce struggle in the Netherlands between Philip II and the revolted provinces, the Huguenot wars in France, were but different acts in the long and terrible drama. The fierceness and implacable cruelty which characterized the Tudor and Puritan conquests of Ireland, during which about 2/3 of the population were cut off by famine and the sword, and the oppression, robbery, and persecutions that followed borrowed much of their intensity from the same religious hatred and fanaticism. The progress of the new faith was thus marked almost everywhere by a trail of desolation and blood, the material effects of which, we shall speak later of the appalling deterioration of morals, weighed heavily on several countries of Europe during the 2 succeeding centuries. Turning of the tide. We have said that Protestantism made very rapid progress during half a century or more after the beginning of Luther's revolt, so that at one time the Church would seem to be imperiled in almost every country of Christendom. The early violence of the movement, however, did not last, and the storm gradually began to subside. Before the beginning of the last quarter of the 16th century, the tide had definitely turned in favor of the ancient faith, and within the next 50 years, the Church had not only consolidated its position, but had regained much of the ground that had been lost. One of the causes of the change was no doubt the bitter dissensions and numberless divisions among the Protestants themselves. But the root cause of the Catholic recovery was the real reform which was wrought in the discipline and administration of the Church. The inspiring force in this counter-Reformation was the work of the Great Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563. A decisive element in carrying out the work of reform were the labors of the Society of Jesus, which was founded in 1540. Austria, Bavaria, and the other portions of southern and western Germany that were endangered, as well as Hungary and Poland, were thus substantially saved to the Church. Heresy was stamped out in Spain and Italy through the activities of the Inquisition. Spain's zealous championship of Catholicism did much to check the aggressive policy of the revolted states and strengthen Catholic resistance. The power of Calvinism was broken in France after a series of destructive civil wars, which desolated the country for more than 30 years, from 1562 to 1598. Saving of Ireland. Ireland was saved to the Church partly as a result of the preaching and labors of the Franciscan friars. Another important factor in the work was the coming of Father D. Wolfe, Jesuit, who arrived in the country as a papal delegate in 1560, and succeeded in selecting worthy candidates for the vacant episcopal sees. Later on, the labors of the Jesuit fathers who established a permanent mission in Ireland in 1598. Two other important elements in deciding the religious crisis in Ireland were the exceptional strength among the ordinary people of the Irish Catholic tradition, and the long drawn-out struggle of the Geraldine Wars. The dominant issue in the latter was the religious question. James Fitzmaurice, the Irish Catholic leader, with whom Father Wolfe was in close intimacy, was directly supported by the Pope and the King of Spain. These wars, and the War of the Irish Northern Princes, which succeeded it, by clearing the issues, forced the trimmers and the faint-hearted, whether Irish or Anglo-Irish, to espouse openly one side or the other. And although the Catholic Irish were beaten to the dust in the military contest, the war proved one of the most important elements in saving the country to the Church. During the first quarter of the 17th century, ecclesiastical seminaries for the training of Irish students were opened on the continent, several of them having been endowed by the King of Spain. The constant supply of zealous and well-trained priests from these seminaries during the 17th and 18th centuries made the position of the Church in Ireland practically secure. The preservation of the faith in Ireland, which hung for many years in the balance, has had far-reaching consequences, not only in the country itself, but on the position of Catholicism in the whole modern world. Article 3. Direct consequences of the Protestant revolt. Protestant view. While historians of all schools generally admit that Protestantism produced results of immense importance on European society, they are not in agreement as to what these results actually were. Protestant historians generally strive to hold up the Protestant revolt against the Church, not only as just and necessary in itself, but as the harbinger of numberless social blessings for the European races. They assume almost as a truism that Protestantism did, and by its very nature must, lead not only to a higher and purer moral life among the people, but to democratic freedom, increased intellectual activity resulting in great scientific progress, and above all to economic prosperity and a wider diffusion of material comfort and well-being. In discussing the truth of this view, one may examine the character of the new forces which the Protestant revolt set in motion, and infer what their effects must needs be, and again, the facts themselves as actually recorded in history may be summarized and weighed in the balance. In our brief discussion of the question in which both these methods will be utilized, we hope to show that no part of the Protestant view can be historically proved, and that the greater portion of it is at variance with well-established historical facts. Repudiation of Christian principles and its results. The obligations of the Christian religion cover the whole range of a man's activities, extending even to his inward thoughts and the motives and springs of his actions. Baptism implies, as it were, a new creation which elevates the soul to a higher sphere. All the activities of the baptized Christian, and especially his domestic and social relations, which in Christian teaching hold a position of paramount importance, are expected to be in harmony with his new dignity as the adopted child of God. Hence it happened, as we have already seen, that when the nations were converted to Christianity, the whole character of society gradually underwent a profound change in proportion as the domestic and civil life of the people became attuned to Christian ideals. Religion became intimately bound up with the social life of the people, animating it and penetrating it at every point, so that the whole network of the social relations and practices was built upon the foundations of Christianity. A repudiation of Christianity would thus lead necessarily to an upheaval affecting the very groundwork of society. Now, Protestantism, while not professing to reject Christianity, did repudiate several of its fundamental principles. Repudiation of the Church's doctrines. The Reformers denied the value of good works and the transforming effect of sanctifying grace on the soul. They denied, too, the existence of an organized spiritual power independent of the state, with authority to take cognizance of all the activities of men, and even of their inmost thoughts and desires, and to punish injustice and wrong. Hence, confession was abolished, and all spiritual penalties and sanctions were removed. The usurer, the fraudulent dealer, the oppressor of the poor, had no longer to appear before the inexorable tribunal, from which there is no escape, of a divinely founded church endowed by God with power to admonish, to judge, and to condemn. The criminal was now his own admonitor and judge, except when he came formally within the coercive power of the civil law, which too often he could easily evade. Whereas in England, the Protestant leaders did not formally reject the principle of a Christian hierarchy. They deprived that order of its influence on social life by confining its activities and authority to the sphere of public worship. Besides all this, their teaching tended to restrict the functions of our divine Lord to those of a Redeemer, so that he was no longer held up, at least to the same extent as before, as the teacher and model of men. In contrast with the old traditional ideals of Christianity, religious obligations were thus almost entirely confined to the duties of worship and prayer, and had little or no influence upon political and social life. And of its moral code, having repudiated the teaching authority of the Church, round which all Christian practice and belief had previously centered, Protestant rulers and people were left to the vagaries of their own unaided judgment, and the uncertain impulses of human prejudice and passion. Their moral code ceased to be a definite legal system covering all the activities of life. It became instead a set of more or less vague philosophical maxims and principles, and the application of which every man was his own teacher and judge. One can easily understand how such a far-reaching revolt against traditional principles produced consequences of the first magnitude upon the political, economic, and social life of European society. On this subject, the Protestant author Ingram writes, "It must be admitted that with the whole modern movement, serious moral or social evils were almost necessarily connected. The general discipline which the Middle Ages had sought to institute and had partly succeeded in establishing, having broken down, the sentiment of duty was weakened, along with the spirit of ensemble, meaning the tendency towards mutual cooperation, which is its natural ally, and individualism in doctrine tended to encourage egoism in action. In the economic field, this result is especially conspicuous. National selfishness and private cupidity increasingly dominate, and the higher and lower industrial classes tend to separation and even to mutual hostility. These results were not confined to the revolted provinces. The Reformation weakened the Church's power as a social and civilizing force, even in the countries that remained faithful. This occurred partly as a result of the fatal spread of the spirit of revolt through most of Europe during the early half of the 16th century, partly through the standing example of the new social ideals adopted in the Protestant countries, partly also by directing into the field of religious controversy the energies by which a united Church had, during the Middle Ages, built up a Christian civilization in Europe. Protestantism and democratic freedom. The assertion that Protestantism has introduced into Europe, or promoted, democratic freedom or real liberty of conscience is still more patently untrue. It is a fact, indeed, that at the beginning of the revolt, Luther's professions were radically democratic. He promised to benefit the people at large by curtailing the power of both church and state. But he and his followers ended up by supporting an irresponsible despotism, such as Europe had not known since the days of the pagan emperors of Rome. Incited by Luther's democratic professions and his denunciations of the tyranny and oppression of the rulers, the knights and lesser nobility of many of the German states, and later on the peasants, rose in open revolt against the princes. When the revolution was crushed in blood, 1525, the victorious princes, now without a rival, and no longer kept in check by the moderating influence of the Catholic Church, used their augmented power to establish a despotism which they exercised for their own personal advantage, in opposition to the interests of the people, while Luther, with unscrupulous inconsistency, now proclaimed the doctrine of unlimited power of the rulers. Soon, even the Church and the Protestant states fell completely under the control of the ruling princes, who were thus established as absolute masters of both Church and state. The wealth of the Church, which hitherto had been the patrimony of the poor, its authority, all the ecclesiastical institutions, including hospitals, schools, homes of refuge, etc., passed into the hands of the kings, princes, and the town magistrates. At the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which ended the first phase of the Revolution in Germany, the principle was formally adopted that the prince of each state was free to dictate the religion of each and all of his subjects. The example of the German princes was not lost upon the other European rulers. Within less than a century, the principle of a despotic and a more or less irresponsible government had permeated almost every country in Europe, even those in which the religious tenets of Protestantism had made little progress. Hence, in the 17th century, the King of France, equally with the King of England, claimed to rule by right divine, and, therefore, to hold authority as limitless as that of God, whose plenipotentiary he was. The celebrated principle of Louis XIV, I am the state, is only a logical inference from the principles of the Protestant reformers a century before. We have already spoken of the effects of Protestant Reformation upon the position of the serfs in Germany and the other European countries in which their liberation had not been completed before the Reformation had begun. Not only was any further amelioration delayed for centuries, but in most places the serfs lost, as an outcome of Protestantism, most of the privileges they had previously enjoyed. The religious intolerance of Protestant Germany was imitated or improved upon in the other revolted countries, in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and England, and still more decidedly in the countries where Calvinism was established, such as Switzerland, Holland, and Scotland. In each and all of these countries, through their varying degrees of severity, penal measures were enforced against all the dissenters from the state religion. In Ireland and England, under the Tudors and the Puritans, the most ferocious of all penal codes were enacted against Catholics and others who were unwilling to conform to the established religion. Protestantism and intellectual progress. The assertion commonly made by Protestant writers that Protestantism stimulated intellectual activity and led to intensified scientific and literary progress is not true, or at least cannot be proved. It is true, indeed, that the physical sciences which correspond to one important phase of intellectual activity have made remarkable progress among the European nations during the past 4 centuries, as the higher mental and moral sciences did during the preceding 4, and that some great literature has been produced in Protestant countries, and even by Protestant writers. It is true, also, that some few nations, notably England and Holland, grew immensely in wealth and power during or after the 16th century, and that the beginning of their rise to greatness practically coincided with the change of religion. But it cannot be shown that the change promoted any one of these results. In the first place, it cannot be shown that the intellectual achievements of Europe since the 16th century are on the whole greater, or even as great as those of the preceding 400 years. If they have been greater in the field of physical science, they have been much less in the higher plane of philosophy, theology, and mysticism. Again, most of the masterpieces of European literature, notably those of the Italian, Spanish, and French writers, belong to the Catholic nations, and very many are of direct Catholic inspiration. Even the English Shakespeare, if not Catholic, owes a great deal of his inspiration to purely Catholic ideals, and little or nothing to Protestantism. This applies still more decidedly to the great masterpieces of architecture, sculpture, and painting. Since the rise of Christianity, most of the great works of art have been directly inspired by the Catholic religion, or have been accomplished under church patronage. Under Protestantism, art has, on the whole, not flourished, and it is commonly recognized that the loss of the Catholic faith by a nation is followed by a gradual deterioration of the artistic sense among the people and a lessening of the love of beauty. Even as regards the scientific achievements of the post-Reformation period, or of the Protestant nations, no sound argument can be adduced to show that any portion of the best work has been inspired by Protestantism, or owes its success to the Protestant revolt. Protestantism and economic progress. The like is true, though not to the same extent, of economic progress in the Protestant countries. Such progress has not been confined to them, as the example of Belgium shows, and besides, the Catholic districts of the Protestant countries are, on the whole, as progressive as the Protestant ones. The foundations of England's commercial greatness were laid by the discovery of the New World, before the nation became Protestant. The success was promoted by the people's spirit of initiative and self-reliance, which was largely the effect of the free political institutions of the system of decentralized government, which the country enjoyed. These existed in England before the Reformation, If they survived it to a certain extent, it was now without a long and bitter struggle. They had existed in Germany before Luther's time, but were crushed out, as we shall see, as a result of the Reformation. Besides all this, it cannot be assumed that increased wealth and imperial expansion necessarily imply economic betterment. Economic progress in the true sense cannot be considered apart from the temporal prosperity or material well-being of the people. How completely the increased wealth and imperial expansion of Britain and other Protestant countries have failed to promote the temporal prosperity of the people at large, we shall show when dealing with the modern social question. Article 4. Protestantism and Popperism. Results of the plunder of the Church. Not only is the Protestant revolt mainly responsible for the unsocial character of Britain's economic system, but it was the immediate cause of much of the degrading pauperism that has disfigured British civilization for the past 4 centuries. We have already alluded to the plunder of the Church and the alienation of the revenues devoted to charitable and educational purposes, which took place as a result of the religious revolt. This led directly to dreadful hardship in the case of the poor, to whose benefit most of the ecclesiastical revenues had previously been applied. The confiscated wealth, which according to the law under which the confiscations were carried out, should have been devoted to the service of the state, was in very large measure appropriated by lawyers, court favorites, and other greedy and avaricious adventurers. These henceforth formed a new class of wealthy and unscrupulous plutocrats, who in the following centuries dominated the political and social life of their several countries. Nowhere did this robbery of church's goods produce such disastrous results as in Ireland and Britain. In both these countries, the Protestant Reformation laid the foundations, secure and deep, of extreme individualistic capitalism, with its hideous counterpart of pauperism and oppression of the poor, which forms one of the chief characteristics of their social history during the following centuries. On this aspect of the question, Cardinal Gasquet writes, "Viewed in its social aspect, the English Reformation was in reality the rising of the rich against the poor. Those in place and power were enabled to grow greater in wealth and position, while those who had before but a small share of the good things of this world came in the process to have less. The supposed purification of doctrine and practice was brought about, at the cost of driving a wedge well into the heart of the nation, which established the distinction which still exists between the classes and the masses." The history of this lamentable revolution in England, by which the whole face of a great Catholic nation became permanently disfigured, the great majority of our once happy children plunged in an ever-increasing degradation and misery, and her ideals and principles conformed to a non-Christian instead of a Christian standard, is graphically told by the Protestant writer Cobbett in his History of the Protestant Reformation. "Never," he writes, "since the world began, was there so rich a harvest of plunder." He tells how gold and silver, books and manuscripts, ornaments, paintings, and statuary of priceless value, equally with church, monastery, and convent, fell a prey to the satellites of Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell. The whole country was thus disfigured. It had the appearance of a land recently invaded by the most brutal barbarians, and this appearance it has, even to the present day. Nothing has ever come to supply the place of what has been destroyed. Explaining the social effects of the plunder of the Church, Cobbett writes, "The Catholic Church included in itself a great deal more than the business of teaching religion and administering the sacraments. It had a great deal to do with the temporal concerns of the people. It provided for all the wants of the poor and distressed. It contained a great body of land proprietors, whose revenues were distributed in various ways amongst the people upon terms always singularly favorable to the latter. It was a great and powerful estate, and naturally siding with the people. by its charity and its benevolence towards its tenants, it mitigated the rigor of proprietorship, and held society together by the ties of religion, rather than by the trammels and terrors of the law. Dissolution of the monasteries. The dissolution of the monasteries, with the resulting confiscation of their property, immediately produced overwhelming distress amongst the multitudes who had been maintained by the resources that the religious bodies had administered. It proved disastrous also to the tenants on the monastic lands, which were probably more than 2,000 statute acres in extent. The tenants, who had been accustomed to an easy and sympathetic mode of treatment at the hands of the monks, now passed under the power of harsh and exacting landlords. Rack rents were too often exacted, and the numerous exemptions and privileges to which the tenants had been accustomed were withdrawn. Enclosures and confiscations. Again, the common lands, in which the poor of the neighborhood had from time immemorial possessed common rights, were seized and enclosed in the lords' demesnes, and the numberless other hardships, hitherto unknown, now began to press upon the people. The wanton confiscation of the property of the guilds, hospitals, and almhouses, unjust and indefensible even from the Protestant standpoint, was also disastrous to the interests of the poor. The destruction of the religious schools and colleges, in which so many children were educated free of cost, was still another blow. Even the introduction of a married clergy, which diverted into another channel the energies and resources that would otherwise be expended upon charity, aggravated further the lot of the poor. Vagabondage in England. Hence, it was that the destruction of Catholicism in England gave rise to the sordid Popperism, which has since disfigured English civilization. Cobbett describes in his own eloquent and vigorous style how England, once happy and hospitable, became a den of famishing robbers and slaves. As a result of the plunder of the Church and the destruction of the institutions which had grown up under its influence, the country quickly became filled with the destitute. Immense numbers of these were driven to live as professional robbers. There were, writes Hume, at least 300 or 400 able-bodied vagabonds in every county who lived by theft and rapine, and who sometimes met in troops in the number of 60 and committed spoil on the inhabitants. As many as 500 of this expropriated class were sometimes executed in a single year during the reign of Elizabeth. English poor laws. This state of affairs, a direct result of the Protestant revolt, gave rise to the celebrated Elizabethan legislation on Popperism, as novel as it was harsh, which for the first time standardized pauperism as distinct from poverty. The former was henceforth the status of those who, being destitute of the prime necessaries of life, are maintained at the public expense in the parish poorhouses. They are no longer God's poor, to whom, as the special representatives of Him who became poor for men's sake, special sympathy and even reverence are due. They are now despised outcasts, the pariahs of society. They usually live, or are supposed to live, in the poorhouses, segregated from their wives and children, under a harsh discipline, deprived of the franchise and compelled to wear a special uniform. The following extracts from Palgrave will convey a general idea of the spirit which animated the English post-Reformation legislation on mendicancy and poverty. It was towards the middle and end of the 16th century that measures against it, mendicancy, were in force, possibly in part owing to the sounder teachings of the reformers on the subject. Then we find Southampton ordering that beggars should have their hair cut, and Parliament decreeing punishments on a progressive scale of severity. Whipping, branding, cutting off the gristle of the ear, even death, were the penalties assigned. The Consolidating Act of 1713 lays it down that any person wandering about the country, or any one of a long list of pretenses, is to be summarily arrested and removed to his settlement, or, if he have none, to be dealt with by the poor law authorities of the parish in which he is apprehended. But previously he may be flogged or set to hard labor, or committed for 7 years to the custody of any person who will undertake to set him to work in Great Britain or the colonies. By the Act of 1744, even women are to be flogged for vagrancy, and as late as 1824, flogging is retained as punishment for incorrigible rogues. Such was the spirit introduced by Protestantism into the legislative system of a country that was once the dowry of Mary. Article 5. Protestantism and Morality. Immediate effects upon morality. The assumption that Protestantism brought a higher and purer moral life to the nations that came under its influence does not need elaborate refutation. It is a fact of uncontroverted history that public morality did at once deteriorate to an appalling degree wherever Protestantism was introduced, not to mention robberies of church goods, brutal treatment meted out to the clergy, secular and regular, who remained faithful, and the horrors of so many wars of religion. We have the express testimony of Luther himself, and several other leaders of the revolt, such as Bucer and Melanchthon, as to the evil effects of their teaching, and this testimony is confirmed by contemporaries. Luther's own avowals on this matter are numberless. Thus he writes, "There is not one of our evangelicals who is not 7 times worse than before he belonged to us, stealing the goods of others, lying, deceiving, eating, getting drunk, and indulging in every vice, as if he had not received the holy word. If we have been delivered from one spirit of evil, 7 others worse than the first have come to take its place." And again, "Men who live under the gospel are more uncharitable, more irascible, more greedy, more avaricious than they were before as papists." Even Erasmus, who had at first favored Luther's movement, was soon disillusioned. Thus he writes, "The new gospel has at least the advantage of showing us a new race of men, haughty, impudent, cunning, blasphemous, quarrelers, seditious, furious, to whom I have to say truth, so great an antipathy that if I knew a place in the world free of them, I would not hesitate to take refuge therein." These effects not temporary, but permanent. But these evil effects of Protestantism were not merely temporary, the accidental results of the excitement and confusion which are peculiar to a stage of transition, although they were no doubt intensified thereby, is shown from present-day statistics. The condition of domestic morality is usually best indicated by the statistics of divorce and of illegitimate births, and by the proportion of legitimate children to the number of marriages, while statistics of general criminality, where they can be had, would convey a fair idea of the individual and public morality in any given place. According to these tests, Protestant countries are at the present day much inferior to Catholic countries in domestic and public morality. Protestant and Catholic countries compared. The following examples will help to illustrate this. Italy, Spain, and Ireland are perhaps the most Catholic countries of the world, while Britain, the United States of America, with Denmark and Scandinavia, are the most Protestant. Legalized divorce does not exist at all, 1930 through 31, in any country of the former group. It exists in all of the countries of the latter group, and the number of divorcees is increasing year by year. In England and Wales, there were 3,740 divorces in 1928, about 1 divorce to every 114 marriages. In the United States of America, the number of divorces in 1916 was 112,031, being 1 divorce to every 10 marriages. 10 years later, vis-a-vis in 1926, the number of divorces reached the appalling total of 181,000, being about 1 to every 7 marriages. The statistics of illegitimate births tell a similar tale. Thus, in 1927, the proportion of illegitimate births was 44 per 1,000 for England and Wales, and 29 per 1,000 for the Irish Free State. Again, the Irish Free State has a very high proportion of births to marriages, one of the highest in Europe. England, where the birth rate has now fallen to nearly 16 per 1,000, has the lowest birth rate in the world as compared with the marriage rate. While all Catholic countries have a fairly high birth rate, the birth rate is so low in some Protestant or non-Catholic countries that the human race there is hastening to extinction. This is in fact what has occurred to the original Protestant settlers in the New England states of America, who have practically disappeared, being in large measure supplanted by the Irish, the Canadians, and others. Exact statistics of criminality are difficult to obtain, and trustworthy comparisons between different countries are more difficult still. Anyone, however, who remembers the constant recurrence of the ceremony of presenting white gloves to the judges of the criminal courts in Ireland, owing to the complete absence of criminal indictments a few years ago, when the country was in its normal state, and contrasts this fact with the records of the criminal courts of Great Britain and the USA, may draw his own conclusions. Conclusion. It has been not inaptly said that greed, robbery, oppression, rebellion, repression, wars, devastation, depredation would be a fitting inscription on the tomb of the early Protestantism. We shall see that the later effects of the new religion, though not so violent or dramatic, have fulfilled the promise of its early years.